Central. We are a stats consulting service at UNSW. We provide free statistical support for all PhD students. Sorry, there's someone at the door. And free study design advice for all researchers at UNSW, and also we do statistical reviews of grant applications. We also have a whole bunch of statistics courses coming up in May and throughout the year. So we run an Introduction to Statistics course in R and SPSS. We also run an Introduction to R course if you want to learn how to use R, which is a stat software. And we have a regression course in May following that. And a couple of those courses we run multiple times. So yeah, if you're interested in when our courses are going to run, it's all on our website, and we'll advertise it through our newsletter. The sign-up links should be ready soon. So today's speaker is David Chan. He is new at Stat Central. We're so glad to have him, and he's doing stat support for Southwest Sydney Clinical School and psychiatry. Yeah, and he's going to take us on a journey in data visualization. So yeah.
Thanks for the introduction, Eve, and hopefully this doesn't block too much. I don't remember how to turn it off. So. All right. So thanks, Eve, for the introduction once again. Today we're going to be talking about data visualization. We're going to tackle it from not keeping in mind what software is being used to generate plots of data or data visualizations or charts and whatnot. So it's supposed to be kind of a high-level bird's eye view of how to approach it. So I guess the main question is, why do we visualize data? And thought this was going to happen. Let's see if we can. Does anyone remember how to? Yeah. Does it? Yeah. Cool. So why do we visualize data? And there's quite a wide variety of reasons for this, and I'll cover 3 of them here from kind of different perspectives. So we're thinking about it from perspective of teaching introductory stats. We're wanting something that's a quick and accurate interpretation of the data. And the main reason for this is if you think about a spreadsheet, say you've got like 10 rows, and each of those rows correspond to, say, observations, and you've got columns correspond to variables. That might be easy to get insight about your data, right? Because you only have to deal with, maybe 20 numbers. But imagine you've got like 1,000 rows of information and say 20 columns of it. That's not very doable just looking at the raw data by itself. And that's where data visualization is a very useful tool. So it helps us get insight that way and get a sense of what data we've collected. If we approach it from a data journalism perspective, it can be to describe a story, to support an opinion, or it could be to narrate the timeline of events for a particular media piece. And data used this way is to try invoke some sort of emotion or some sort of response, or help readers inform their opinions and views. So that's another reason why people visualize data. And the last one is statisticians. We use it to help assess model assumptions, to diagnose whether, is this an appropriate model for our data, and so on. In fact, for example, melody checks are primarily done visually nowadays rather than through, say, a Sharp-Wilks test. And that's just because the visual inspection gives us a bit more information on exactly why is it not quite normal or not. And the reasons can go on, but those are the 3 main ones I've got there. And it all stems from this kind of quote from John Tukey, which kind of captures the whole talk. The greatest value of a picture is when it forces us to notice what we never expected to see. And to kind of get to this point, a lot of iteration does go into data visualization, even for something as simple as a scatter plot, all the way to infographics used in, say, news pieces, for example. So just to illustrate this at the moment, I've got this scatter plot here of babies' birth weights by the gestational period. And we're not going to focus too much on relationship here, but we're going to focus on a different aspect. Does anyone want to take a guess how many observations there are? So how many points there are on the scatter plot? 250. We've got one. I can't see chat on Zoom, unfortunately. So 800. 530. Right. And, it's quite hard to tell, right? And so kind of maybe one thing we want to do to just this really simple scatter plot is, well, we want to make sure that the viewer of this plot can get a sense of how many observations there are without a caption. Maybe we can do something like tweaking the transparency of the point and maybe even just changing it from an open point to a solid point. And we kind of see that it's still a bit, can't really tell. We know there's a lot of points in here. And I believe the closest answer we got was 800. So we got 1,223 of them. We kind of see that the transparency here, just from that simple iteration, didn't really get us that much further just from the plot itself. We still need to talk with the plot to communicate the number of observations. And this iteration point is going to keep coming up throughout the whole talk. So what I'm actually talking about today, well, I'm going to define some jargon that I've used just before. So what do I mean by observation? What do I mean by a variable? We'll go through some of the common statistical data visualizations. So these are commonly what you'll see if you're taking our short courses. These will be visualizations you'll see. And we'll go through some effective data visualization principles that are not inherently linked from a statistics perspective, but are good to consider, especially when you're making plots for journals or talks. And then we'll have a look at a variety of different plots. So, good, bad, ugly plots, as well as some that been some of the data visualization principles that I will describe in this seminar. So the first question I've got for everyone is it a plot, graph, or chart? And what I've quickly learned, so take a minute to think about it while I describe my train of thought. Your default choice of word depends where you've learned how to visualize data from. So I think one of my ex-colleagues says that in the New Zealand context, we like using the word plot a lot. So that's why you see me defaulting to plot. But you'll never, bar plot doesn't sound quite natural, right? So we say bar graph or bar chart, for example. So we use these three words interchangeably a lot. And so if you see me swapping between them, I'm talking about the same thing, talking about a visualization of data. The next thing we just want to establish in terms of jargon. So I have already used some of this already. So the idea of observation, value, and variable. And just to clarify what I mean by this, an observation is an individual that we measure or categorize data about. So we think about, let's say we're interested in studying apples. Well, in this case, an apple is our observation. And from this observation, we can measure some values about it. So say the color of its skin, the color of its flesh, its sugar content, and so on. And what I mean by variable is a collection of one specific type of data collected on all observations in our data set. So a set of all observations we collected for a study. So variable in this case would be the color of our apples in our data set. So specifically the color of the skin, or it could be the sugar content of our apples. And with variables in particular, we can split them further as well with numeric variables. Some people may know this as a quantitative variable. And this kind of pictures that data that can be best described by numbers. So something discrete, such as the number of siblings or the age, specifically measured in years here. You can measure age in different ways as well, but that's one example of a discrete measurement. Or can be continuous. So anything you can kind of measure with a tool. and maybe the measurement error or measurement precision is dependent on the tool. Say, for example, blood pressure. Some blood pressure measurements can only go up to, say, 1 or 2 decimal places. Some can go further. Or 100-meter sprint times will be conditioned. The scale of measurement or measurement precision will be dependent on the exact tool you use. So think for the Olympics, they go up to nanoseconds or a bit more finer for the timing there, but you get the idea. You can keep going if your measurement tool is great. The other type of variable, big umbrella, I should say, is categorical variables. So this is the one where some people may learn it as qualitative variables or factors. And my elevator pitch here is that it's data that can be best described by some text. So if we're talking about colors of apples, we're talking about, like, is it red or green, for example. And this can have no order to it. So if we're thinking about the local health district boards in New South Wales, for example, there's no kind of order to what the district health boards are. Or they can be ordinal. And this is where the definition of numeric and categorical kind of bleed in. And my example of this is the number of Wordle guesses. Yeah, because you can beat Wordle 1 guess up to 6, or you can lose. So even though most of the values you can observe are numeric, because the last thing, a loss, is best described with some text, it's more accurate to describe it as an ordinal categorical variable, because it can go from best placement to worst. So that's a lot of the jargon I'll be using throughout this talk, is just really defining variables and observations. So let's talk about some principles, or let's talk about common statistical data visualizations first, I should say. So we're thinking about visualizing one numeric variable. Kind of the go-to from a stats perspective is a dot plot. And some people prefer adding the prefix stat dot plot. And the reason for this is because we plot our values of a numeric variable on an axis, on a single axis. Its position is the value we observe, and we stack other observations values for that numeric variable on top of each other. Depending on your software, that could be an automatic determination of what's considered similar enough. And there's a lot of information there, and sometimes this plots might not be appropriate, and you've got too much data. And that's where a box plot comes in play here. It summarizes our data, though, into 5 distinct points, though. A minimum, so the lowest value, the lower quartile, kind of roughly where 25% of the data threshold is. The median, so the exact middle of our data. Upper quartile, so the next 25% of data, followed by the maximum. And you may note, if you're familiar with box plots, sometimes you get additional points, which I'll call, quote, outliers, because what they call an outlier is actually a pre-specified rule that is dependent on which software you use to make your box plots. So even though it's really convenient to say the box plot says an outlier, don't say that. Just say it looks interesting. And the last common data visualization for one numeric variable is a histogram. And what you may note here, for this particular data set, it's really similar to the dot plot. And that's kind of its attempt, right? A histogram is kind of like an approximation of the dot plot. And what it's doing here is that we're splitting our numeric variable into kind of little numeric intervals, all linked with one another, and we count how many points fall within each of those intervals, which denote the height of the bars. Notably, for histograms, the bars do not have gaps between them, and that's because we're splitting up a numeric variable into intervals of values. So those are the 3 common numeric ones for a single numeric variable. We're looking at one categorical variable. From a statistics point of view, and I need to make this emphasis, we focus a lot on bar plots. So this could be a single categorical variable, say species, as I've got up here, and we're just saying how many penguins were Adelaide penguins, how many penguins were chinstrap penguins, and how many were Gintu penguins. And the height of the bars corresponds to how many observations had that particular text value. You can do this as counts or as proportions. So you may see some cases people like doing stacked bar plots, and you can do this with proportions quite easily. And it's presenting the same data, but we do lose kind of the idea of, what's the sample size? How many observations do we have, right? There are ways to tweak that, but that's beyond the scope of this particular slide. We now start thinking about two variables here. I'm only going to focus on two numeric and two categorical. We've got our default scatter plot. So for those who didn't really follow the birth weight versus gestational example, what we've done here is we set the y-axis, so the vertical axis, as the one numeric variable, and the horizontal. Did I get my horizontal vertical mixed up again? I did, didn't I? The vertical axis is one variable, and the horizontal axis is the other. And then we essentially treat it as kind of like a map. And then we plot on the map an observations values for those two numeric variables. And that gives us an idea about, is there some sort of relationship between the two numeric variables, or is there something else more interesting going on? And the other kind of common two numeric variable visualization here involves an aspect where you've got some sort of time aspect to your data. So for this penguin data set, we actually collected this data over 3 years. So what I've got here is the count on our y-axis, also our vertical axis of the species, and on the x-axis, we've got time. So that is the year when the penguin was sampled. And what we've done here with time series plots commonly, the observations are usually depicted as points, and we connect those points with lines. So those are the two common two numeric variable plots, and from a statistics perspective. Then lastly, I decided to do side-by-side bar plots for two categorical variables. What we're doing here is trying to visualize the count or proportion of one particular categorical variable, in this case, the species, by levels of a second categorical variable, such as, for example, the sex of the penguin. And you'll note there I say version 1, because if you swap it around, so if you go sex by species, you get an entirely different side-by-side bar plot. And this does confuse everyone every now and then. Easiest way to check is whether the bars of the same color sum up to 1. Right, and you'll note that I did this for proportions in particular. You can do this with counts as well, but people do prefer proportions depending on the research question that they're trying to answer with their data. But that's the common one there. And you'll probably note I've never talked about pie charts. Wait till the last slide. So those are our common statistical data visualizations of bar plots, dot plots, histograms, scatter plots, and so on. How do we tweak them to improve our visualization of data? And you can kind of go anywhere. And the main thing I would like to emphasize here is that even something as simple as a scatter plot, keep iterating on your visualization. And this image that's got up here is kind of a really good explanation up until the last point. I'll get to that shortly. So you got your data, right? So we're thinking like, we've got too much data. We can start, sorting and arranging it to figure out which visualization is appropriate for our data. So for example, for numeric data, we shouldn't be using bar plots for that, for example. And for categorical variables, we shouldn't be using, say, a histogram, right? So we're tweaking that, we're iterating on it. We get something that looks good, but is it actually the story that the data is trying to tell us? And that's something you should always ask yourself when you're thinking you're the final data visualization you're up to. let's say, for example, if you record the scatter plot of the penguin's bill lengths and bill depths, what's one thing that could potentially drive that relationship? It's the species of the penguin, right? So we haven't really finished that plot yet, because what happens if the species of penguin changes what we interpret from the figure or from the plot itself. So iterating is very important. The second principle, I should say, if possible, avoid hiding data. This includes hiding outliers from a plot. This includes choosing a type of plot that is deceptive to or hiding features of the data. So here I've got a data set that's of a famous geyser in the US, and we're trying to plot the waiting times to the next eruption. What kind of insights would you get from this particular box plot by itself? Have a think about that for a few seconds while I have some water. Would we say that there might be one peak in the data? So talking a bit more about the shape, can we infer that from a box plot? You can't really, right? And because a box plot by itself is just visualizing 5 numeric summary statistics about our data. So here, I've got a histogram of the same data. What do you think the box plot was hiding from the whole data set, from the data itself? So I see some people drawing 2 peaks. So that's what I mean by avoid hiding features of your data. It is really important because you don't want to mislead readers about what your data is. So that's an important aspect of data visualization, effective data visualization. My third point here is be aware of deceptive perspectives. Now, this covers a wide range of things, I hope. So talking about breaking axes. So for example, maybe we should break the axes at 100, for example. The inclusion of 0 in one of your numeric axes. Or it could be even just squishing the data enough that this line looks straight, right? And there's other ways you can get deceptive perspectives as well, such as making the plot really wide or super squished itself. So what would be a best way of approaching this? Well, going back to the first point about iteration, you want to make sure that you're trying to then showcase what story your data is trying to tell. So usually with most statistical software, it will just default to the range of your data points. And usually this is good enough. But I want to add a caveat that if your data, if 0 is a meaningful value, you might want to consider, breaking the y-axis before your data, I should say, or even including it in your data visualization, because that might be contextually important, or any other contextually important values as well. But this is something that people debate about every now and then. So, but the main take home here is that, make sure you're not trying to deceive people with the perspective of your figure. Number 4 is to avoid chart junk. So while I take another sip of water, discuss among yourselves or on Zoom, what's wrong with this plot? Or anything dodgy you notice. Axis doesn't start at 0. That's probably an important number in this case, right? Because they're trying to motivate that under President Obama, more students are earning their high school diplomas. Anything else that doesn't look quite right here? I mean, obviously, should we be using stacks of books as the bars? That's an example of chart junk, but what's more wrong or more suspicious about this plot? sort of rotated. That's another one.
The change from 78% to 79% is quite big, when from 79 to 80 is smaller.
Yeah, so start seeing here that this plot looks to be over-iterated, right? The difference between 78 to 79, even 79 to 80, and these three here, these are not all equal jumps. And this tends to happen a lot more with infographics, so things presented in the media, and why sometimes, in this case, breaking the y-axis is probably okay here, but if you were to visualize this, using a standard bar plot as described earlier, it paints a really different story, and we can start seeing why data visualizations can be used as a tool to kind of mislead or even lie. So all in all, if you want to make your plot really pretty, try not twist things to emphasize a point. Number 5, color choice does matter. So here to start off with, we've got 2 sets of colors. We've got the heat map colors in R, and here in this pie chart, and the default color wheel as the third one. And what I've got here with the second and fourth pies is what a red-green colorblind person will perceive those colors as. And you kind of immediately see that you want your visualization to make sense to as many people as possible. That's one reason why color choice matters, because red and green colorblindness, I think, is the most common. So there are software tools out there to help you discern if your color choice matters. There's people whose research focus a lot on color. And when the slides are available, this link here takes you to kind of like scratching the surface of how deep that literature goes. But another thing I would like to point out here about color choice matters, we note that the default color wheel in R only goes up to 8 colors. And the main reason for that from experience, once you have 8 or more colors on your plot, it starts becoming very difficult to discern between them, especially if they're all over the place, right? So you got points overlapping on each other, just like the baby's example, right? And it becomes really hard. So there's other options to deal with that, but if you're trying to deal with color, 8 is pushing it. Once you get past that point, you might have to dig quite deep for a color palette that works. And my last kind of principle here for effective data visualization is that 3-dimensional plots are a trap. And largely because most software that lets you add a 3rd dimension does it aesthetically. So that's, it makes it look prettier, but it then makes it harder to read in one go. So if you're thinking about, you're wandering a poster hall at a conference, the 3D bar, say your 3D pie chart, for example, catches someone's eye, but then they have to spend a solid 30 seconds figuring out what's going on. That's no longer as effective, and that's why people statisticians particularly dislike 3D plots. In fact, I can only think of 2 cases where 3D plots are okay in statistics, and they get more into the mathy part of it. And even then, people in that part of statistics avoid 3D plots like the plague. So if you need to add a 3rd dimension, explore iterating your plot in a different way every time. So those are kind of the 6 principles there. Iterate, avoid being deceptive, avoid chart junk, color choice, make sure you consider that, avoid 3-dimensional plots, and I knew I was going to forget one of them. Let's see if I can do it with, you know what, you guys can go through the slides to work out which one I forgot. So those are the 6 main things we walked through there. What are some visualizations out in the wild? So we're going to start off that baby birth weight versus gestation example again. And we noted that transparency didn't really solve this issue of trying to figure out how many observations there are at a glance. And there are multiple ways of dealing with this with a scatter plot. One way is transparency, as we described before, but the other strategy is to make use of an extension known as hexagon binning. And this takes a page out of the basic numeric plot, a histogram, where we're trying to communicate the idea of frequency and then plotting it as a point on a scatter plot itself. So you can start seeing here, which do you find it more convincing now with this hexagon plot? I think I can zoom in, unsuccessful, that there's roughly about 1,000 plus observations here. This was a really nice example. Mileage may vary, which is why I'm really hammering the point of iterating on data visualization. You might have to use other tricks and stuff, but it is a good one. And this is because it's commonly used for survey data, the hexagon binning trick for scatter plots. My second example here, some people see it as a saving space, and that is a perfectly valid point. But there are times where having two y-axes on a time series plot, for example, with different scales can be appropriate. It is very rare. So here I've got COVID-19 wastewater surveillance data in New Zealand. And what they've done with the green line, this time series plot, they've plotted the genome copies per person per day, and superimposing that on a totally different axis is the new cases reported per day for the last 12 months. And you're probably wondering, what are some things to consider if you really want to do this yourself with your own data? And my only kind of point I've got here, unfortunately, is you need to consider whether those two numeric variables are actually related in some way, shape, or form, or you can justify that they're kind of, in a sense, correlated with each other over time, perhaps. But there are times where this is appropriate, and that's what I just want to point out here with this example. Our third example here is that following the data journalism kind of perspective, you can invoke a message with your plot here. So here we've got a upside down histogram. And we probably know already just from the title of this particular plot, that they probably deliberately chose the color red, right? And this plot's really big, and so I'm going to see if I can open it up on the side. And we kind of see here that, this is effectively a histogram with some really weird choices, because the numeric intervals will probably be months. So it'll be a number of the toll per month, probably. And we can see that if we examine this histogram a bit further, it does seem it does follow the same rules as a histogram, except the y-axis is flipped upside down. And one thing, if you were to flip this plot the right way up, which I don't think I can do easily in Chrome, so no, I can't do it easily. Don't remember what a rotate button is. That's fine. But if you flip it upside down the right way around, it might not invoke that same message that the media piece this plot accompanies is trying to communicate or narrate to a reader, right? Because you don't get that kind of sense of dread, perhaps. So you can use data visualization in this way, but mainly from a data journalism perspective rather than a scientific perspective, per se. My fourth example here is when chart junk becomes chart magic. So I'll walk you through this plot. And one thing I want to point out here is that in a journal setting or in a conference setting, you've got time to explain what's going on in the plot, just as I'm doing now. So here along the x-axis, so the horizontal axis, we've got the year, so 1900 and so on. on the y-axis, we've got the duration of war that's being plotted. The stems here corresponds, essentially joins up when the war started to when the war ended. You can note that the data has been collapsed a little bit because there's some wars that lasted exactly a year. So it started that year and ended that year. And then the size of this point here, which looks kind of like a poppy, hence the poppy field data visualization, which this chart comes from, corresponds to the number of soldiers that died or were recorded to have died in that particular war. And the color indicates which regions were involved in wars. So kind of start seeing here that there are ways to, after careful consideration, to make your charts look graphically pretty, right? But this particular plot here, and this comes from Paul Morale, one of the people behind developing graphics using the R software, said he's mentioned, I remember that talk, that this took a while to convince himself that this is an okay infographic, right? So there are ways to make it look, graphically and aesthetically pleasing. The one thing you want to make sure when you think about making junk into magic is whether the image that you want to use instead of like a standard scatter plot point is whether that actually scales well or not, or doesn't cause deception into how someone reads the plot. Our fifth plot here was a request from my colleagues. So here we've got group means and error bars, and the default plot in a lot of publications is a bar chart with little things poking out. But if we're talking about means, is that numerical categorical? It's a numeric value, so a bar chart's not very appropriate to start off with. And yes, the little things poking out, the error bars, we note that this plot doesn't define what kind of error bars they are. That's something you do need to include somewhere in the plot, especially if it's on a poster. You probably want to say that, it's a mean plus or minus whatever the measurement is. But let's try to iterate on this. So we know that means are numeric. We shouldn't be using bars. So, we're changing to points here. And then we're just replacing the error bars with just lines. So, bit of improvement. We still haven't quite defined what the error bar is. And we're like, well, actually, what is the data that leads to this particular result? And one common extension to dot plots or slash box plots or whatnot is to actually plot the data alongside it. So here we can now start getting a bit more context about, are these means like separated or not? And maybe the drivers behind the reasons why. You can still see here, I do need to do one more iteration on this plot, which is what is the length of those error bars? Because I can tell you right now, I worked with people where they've done one standard error, two standard errors, 95% confidence interval, and more recently from a blog post, 83.4% confidence intervals. So yeah, do define that, because if you think about it from a poster perspective, they're just going to look at your plot as the first thing probably, and make sure that plot has as much information about what you're visualizing. And to wrap up, have a chat for a minute. I'm going to have some water about this particular plot. So I don't have Zoom chat open, unfortunately, so sorry, Zoom, but is there anything that looks quite wrong? Right, you can use the heading of the slide to help figure out what's wrong. I don't blame you, because I do want to talk about this point in general. So this is a pie chart. Okay, fine. We statisticians aren't big fans of pie charts, but if you think about it as a pie chart, your immediate gut instinct is to be, we've got proportions represented as slices of the pie, right? But what's the one thing that the annotations are doing to throw you off that? We've got annotations for 42%. So, maybe we should have 58%. No, we go to 49%, 26, 42, and so on. So apart from the thing pie charts, the main thing I want to point out here with plot annotations, be careful not to confuse the reader, right? So here we can see that our kind of gut instinct is to interpret it as proportions or slices of a pie. So, human eye is not really good at discerning area. That's kind of a side point. The main point here is that we're not using the plot as it's supposed to be designed for, and these annotations aren't very helpful, right? So if you do annotate your plots, some things to keep in mind is that make sure that they are following intuitively what your viewers will interpret them as. Like, don't just give it to your colleagues, give it to people. Like, if I annotate the plot like this, do you interpret it the same way as I do? So on. And that will help prevent confusion, just like this not pie chart up here. So those are some of the charts I found in the wild. I can find more, but we'll be here all day. So that's effective data visualization, and talking about some points scattered throughout our examples and our principles of how to tackle it. So thank you for your time. So I'm going to try find Zoom. And... Okay.
If you ask.
Let me think. Did I manage to hide Zoom?
Don't worry, we'll read out.
Oh yeah, cool. See. I think I'm.
If anyone on Zoom has questions for David, if you either unmute yourself, I think we'll hear you, or pop them in the chat. Yeah, thanks for the great talk, David.
Control H, Control Shift H, Shift H.
Alternatively, you're also free to ask questions about Stat Central.
Nothing online.
Nothing online.
Meant to be a fun talk.
I guess maybe I'll ask.
Yep.
So, say like a group or a meetup team that does the visualization of car stuff.
Yeah, so
Not
not that we hear. So I don't know of one. I do know that.
There's a codars group.
They're not active.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They might, if enough people sign up, who knows, maybe they'll reactivate. But yeah, the codars was running last year or the year before, maybe. But they didn't get a lot of people coming to stuff. Oh, so there's a question online.
Oh, yep.
As well. Yeah, so I'm not sure, like, you definitely can run it by us.
Mhm.
To review any comments. But we do run, like, if you want to know how things are done, we have a course in bar that does some space about visualization. And sometimes we run an advanced, is it advanced bar have more visualization stuff?
they do, yeah. So the intermediate R course, they do a bit more. They do sort of data wrangling, plotting. Yeah.
Just want an easy way to type your ones to
Ah.
actually having to do it.
Yeah, means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's ask this.
Yeah.
So one of the questions was great talk, Stina. What's the best way for p-values to be presented on the graph?
Oh, that's.
You might want to repeat it in case.
Yeah.
So the question was, what's the best way for p-values to be added to a graph?
So, my take on that is that it's best added as a annotation to the plot, because there's not really a great way of visualizing it as like an extra component, I guess. So you might have it a bit easier if you're doing comparisons between groups. You can kind of, in a sense, spice up the plot to highlight where the statistically significant differences between group means are. But in general, if you're just thinking about adding a single p-value, usually top right, I say top right corner as in nothing goes in the top right corner, but usually somewhere in the plot, you can kind of stick the p-values there as a text plot annotation. And that usually does the trick. So, yeah.
Another question?
Yeah, thanks for the interesting talk. I guess, like the recommendations there, they were based on the assumption that the primary goal is to communicate your results clearly, and everything else is not really considered, I guess. And there are other considerations all the time. I mean, people do want to make a pretty graph.
Yep.
So, and you know, there's this whole movement about art, creating art. So, I mean, should we think about other stuff as well? Like whether it does look pretty?
Like, so this is where it becomes more of an art instead of a science, right? So I think, for example, the plot I've got with the poppy field visualization, if I just pop that up, this probably took a lot of iterations to get it looking like this, right? And how I want to phrase this without sounding so negative. Usually at this stage, you have a graphics designer, if you want to, in a sense, make it more artistic, working alongside you as well. And I can't speak too much about how you collaborate with a graphics designer, but that is something you do need a person you need to work with, help inform them, you know, what are the things you need to do to not make things look deceptive from a presentation perspective, but also give them the ability to, you know, make it look nice. So yeah, it's a bit out of my field, but that's kind of the starting point, is actually collaborating with a proper graphics designer first. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Well, thank you, David, and thanks to everyone that came along. And yeah, get in touch with us if you have